everybody. Welcome to Skeleton Keys. I'm John Booker.
I'm Torri and John. And together we're going to try to unlock the mysteries of mythology and history in pop culture.
Today, Torri, we are going down the rabbit hole with one of my favorite pop culture figures. I have been into Snoop Dogg for a long time, and I couldn't be more thrilled that I'm getting to take an academic ruler to Snoop Dogg and measure the many ways in which he has contributed to my academic thinking.
I am so curious because I know you're a big hip hop head. I want to see your love of Snoop come out because I'm ready.
Well, that is a very, very true statement. I am indeed a hip hop head, and I am an old school hip hop head, especially. I love this era of Snoop and Dr. Dre, and this particular era of hip hop. It's special to me. And maybe it's because I live in Los Angeles and I feel like so much of the music that the two of them made was a soundtrack to life in Los Angeles. But I think there's something more. I really believe that Snoop fits an archetype in our modern culture. And I didn't really have language for that until studying mythology, when I began to learn about this god of Dionysus. And Dionysus, of course, is a god who is associated with many things, with the theater, with wine. And we'll talk about some of these things as far as who Dionysus is. But I really do believe Snoop is our modern Dionysus. And we're going to connect Snoop to Dionysus in a number of different ways on this episode. But I have to ask you, were you allowed to listen to Snoop's music growing up? At what point did you become exposed to the D-O-double-G there, Torri?
Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
My mom would not allow it. My dad did, however, because my dad is a big George Clinton fan.
Yes.
And was very into the sample that Snoop Dogg used.
Yes.
So I was allowed to listen to West Coast hip hop with my dad purely because of that sample. So shout out to Dad.
Yeah, for those listening who don't know who George Clinton is the father, the inventor, creator of a type of music known as funk music. He was the head of a number of different bands throughout the 70s and 80s and still performs today, but probably best known for his band Parliament Funkadelic. And they had a number of hits that reached the pop charts, but really they were gods among the African-American community in certain areas of the country. Torri, you should talk about this more than me, but it really was a style of music that I am told Black people felt was more their own, that it wasn't something that crossed over, but it was something that was owned within the Black community.
Absolutely. I think it was coming up at the time of disco, but there was a little bit more bass, literally, to the music. My father is a member of the Omega Psi-Phi fraternity, and they're known as the Q Dogs. So Atomic Dog is their theme song. And I don't know if anyone out there has been around a Q. When Atomic Dog comes on, they lose their mind.
Well, and Snoop took elements of Atomic Dog and used it throughout his music. Actually, if there was any one song that comes up more than any others in Snoop's music, it's probably Atomic Dog. There's a little refrain that goes bow, wow, wow, yippee-oh, yippee-ay, that is used in so much of Snoop's music. And I think one reason that it's important to talk about George Clinton and to talk about funk music and how that brought us Snoop is actually many of the topics and subjects that Snoop talks about in his music, and more of the Dionysian god of pleasure and wine and excess, those originated with George Clinton. The Atomic Dog concept is about a part of men that is prone to chasing the ladies, shall we say. The words to that song were interesting because it was questioning this within men, but it was also saying this is a part that we feel is organic. It would say, why must I be like that? Why must I chase the cat? It ain't nothing but the dog in me. and agree, disagree. These were discussions and topics that were not happening at that point in music. And I really do feel like it wasn't just the sound of George Clinton and in Parliament that Snoop was emulating when he was sort of finding his identity and voice in pop culture as this modern Dionysus, but it was also the thematic ideas. Dionysus is often seen as this god who's lounging with nude women, and that sexuality is a key part of the Dionysian archetype. And Snoop didn't create that. He also sort of downloaded that from George Clinton as well. So there's your little bit of a Funk 101 education for the day, listeners.
You're welcome.
Right.
I think you're right on it, though. I think if we could even say George Clinton is a part of this archetype as well, of kind of this free spirit, fun loving.
Yeah.
But I think in kind of examining Snoop, he didn't come out with that image.
Right.
It was very much like he's getting murder raps.
Right.
Like he came straight from kind of like that gangsta, especially with like Doggy Style, that kind of when he was working with Dre.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really interesting is that Dionysus, especially kind of in the early formation of him, yes, he's the god of wine and kind of not luxury, but kind of being languorous. But he was also known for dismemberment and known for being like a kind of god of rebirth, of death and rebirth. So they both kind of have this beginning that is seen as more violent and more not as fun-loving as we might associate with either of them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in that, I think you bring up a really interesting point there, because Snoop's introduction to the world was a guest appearance on one of Dr. Dre's songs that was part of a musical soundtrack. He was playing this character on the song that is going deep cover, which is the soundtrack was for this movie called Deep Cover. And he's basically taking the position that if they find out someone in their crew is an undercover cop, they will murder that person.
187 on an undercover cop.
Exactly. So I think there is something about this character that Snoop began introducing himself to the world to that starts out in conflict, that starts out in drama. And you're right. He later, as he begins to more fully introduce himself to the world through the album Doggy Style, that's when we begin to see a more well-rounded Snoop that is not just playing a character on a song, but is introducing himself as a persona that is really, in many ways, finding healing or trying to stop the pain of so much of the poverty and crime that's around him through substances like alcohol and weed, in much the way that, again, Dionysus brings a transcendence of our normal world and often our pain through wine. Snoop was finding that in debaucherous behavior with the opposite sex. And that, again, is something that we see associated with Dionysus. And again, I think it's very easy to look at the artistic work of Snoop as well as the mythology around Dionysus. And it's very easy to sort of hold a modern woke lens to that and be very judgmental of that. And I will be the first person to say I am very against anyone treating women poorly. I'm very against any sort of substance that's going to cause damage or harm in someone's life. But if we can get past those initial moral frameworks, I think we can get into an interesting discussion about how people really need these certain archetypal presences in their life to make sense of the world around them. What do you think, Torri? Am I off base on this? Are you on that boat?
I think I'm completely in agreement with you. And I think you can even see that with Dionysus, with the history of Dionysus, is that for years with Dionysian cults, is that it was kind of a safe space for women, for people who were of lower economic status, because especially in ancient Greece, that was very, you stayed in your lane. That's where you are. But with Dionysian cults, it was kind of everyone could be who they wanted to with the influence of wine. But it was later in history, specifically when Alexander the Great was coming into Greece and kind of I guess, ascending to his exalted position, that these higher ups were like, oh, we can kind of lose ourselves in that Dionysian like energy as well. And then it became legitimized. So I think it very much is, it's something that is needed, but I think it is easy for us to look at it with a judgmental of, oh, well, you shouldn't do that. But historically, there's always needed to kind of be a release, a space for people to feel what they want to feel regardless of judgment. And Snoop provides that.
Well, you really get, I think, what's important with that word release. You see this in so many of the Dionysian rituals, the cult festivals, this idea of release. There were some rituals associated with women in Greece at the time that women would go to these 3-day rituals. And the first day, there was a period of the ritual that the women would literally spend a good deal of time screaming profanities into the air. And it was meant to be this time of release. Men weren't not allowed to come to these rituals. It was just for women. And I personally have to believe it was probably because the way that women were being treated in Greece for much of that time, they probably needed that release of screaming into the atmosphere about so much of the things they were being forced to put up with. But I do think that Snoop and Dionysus very much connect to this idea of release. And certainly any release can go to excess. If that's the only place we live is in excess and in release, then it's going to be a problem. It's going to be problematic for us. But I think part of what mythology is pushing us towards, and we see this certainly in Greek mythology, is trying to find a more balanced life, or trying to find a life that makes space for all these different expressions and makes space for the difficulties to have an outlet and have an expression, which, again, I think Snoop is a pop culture figure, but also his music is meant to provide that, which, by the way, Dionysus also has a connection to music. Snoop is not just known for appearing on cooking shows and smoking weed. He obviously is a musician.
Young people learn that.
Well, it's that time in the episode, Torri, that we release a skeleton from our own closet. And because we're dealing with drug use here, I thought it would be fun to share with the audience a story. I once went to Taiwan and I was looking for souvenirs to bring back home. And I found these really amazing, well, I later came to find out that these were pipes for smoking hashish. And I bought some of these pipes and I brought them back home. And it didn't strike me that that's what they were. I thought they were just cool decorative pieces. And it hit me the moment that I was handing one to my mother as a gift to her, that this was a pipe. And so she's holding it and she says, "What is this?" And I grabbed it by the long end of the pipe. I turned the bell end upside down and I said, "Mom, it's a candle snuffer."
Great save.
Yep.
Great save.
It was one of the best saves of my life when I turned a hashish pipe into a candle snuffer and saved my reputation with my mom. So, Mom, if you're listening to this, it's confession time. And that candle snuffer that you keep on the mantle is actually a hashish pipe. I'm sorry. I didn't realize it until I was giving it to you. But Torri, that is my skeleton that I'm letting out of the closet this week.
I feel honored that you shared that with us. That was very brave and smart.
Yeah.
I would never, I'm not that quick on my feet. Which is quite obvious from this next story. My skeleton key is not from a pipe. We'll go with Dionysus. My first time drinking, I waited till I was 21.
Good for you.
Thank you. It wasn't great. Basically, my birthday is in December, and I was in college at the time. And when your birthday's in December, people can't really hang out because they're with their families.
Yes.
And so I was at home by myself at my family's house with my mom and my brothers. And a friend of mine had gotten me an entire handle of Jack Daniels for my birthday. Mind you, my mother doesn't drink. So she doesn't understand that when I'm chugging Jack Daniels by myself, that this isn't a good thing. My brothers knew. I somehow drank like 3/4 of a handle of Jack Daniels on my own and decided to slide down our family steps in a sleeping bag because I thought it was a sled. Multiple times.
Amazing.
So maybe Dionysus got into me, but I don't think he would have taken credit for that. I wouldn't.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Wow.
It was not a pretty morning. Let's just say it wasn't great the next day.
These skeletons out of the closet moments are becoming one of my favorite little segments on our podcast here. Just, I feel like I get to know you in a whole different way, Torri Yates-Orr.
We're learning so much.
I know. Well, before we get to our special guest today, I want to bring up one other area of Snoop Dogg's career that I believe really does tie into the archetype of Dionysus. And Dionysus was also the god of the theater in Dionysian theaters in Greece, specifically the first theater, which was a temple dedicated to Dionysus in Athens. For me, very much connects to Snoop. Even before Snoop had appeared in films and television shows, there was a moment at the 1993 VMA Awards that Snoop had actually just been involved in a murder case where he was involved in a situation where he had to go to court and was being considered as a potential murderer in a particular case. And he created a performance in 1993 around his song Murder Was the Case that people still talk about to this day. And as far as big pop culture moments go, this theatrical presentation of what was going on inside of him as he was being tried for murder, I will never personally forget it because it was one of the first times that I felt like something that was happening in real life was given a theatrical expression in a way that resonated with me like no film or television show had that year. So have you seen, Torri, moments that you feel like Snoop has really drawn on that theatrical energy that Dionysus is so associated with?
I completely agree with you on that performance. That performance, if you look at it, is really big in scope. There's a massive hanging cross above the performance stage. It's a huge scale. Yeah. And in a way, it's very kind of like the Greek theater where it moves up in a very traditional way. And this is the theater nerd in me coming out. It's not a horizontal, it's not a flat stage. Yeah. It's up like almost a traditional Greek stage.
Yes.
But I think just in general, Snoop has so much theater in his work. Yeah. Even from the way he raps as a character, like no one raps like Snoop. Right. You know him from the jump. Right. But also even in the evolution of his career, like we were talking about, he kind of got started with Dre as like with Deep Cover. And then he kind of evolves into when he was with No Limit, kind of a lighter version, not as much gangsta, kind of with the ladies. Yes. And then he evolves into Drop It Like It's Hot. Yep. And then now he's hosting a cooking show with Martha Stewart. Like he understands like these different aspects of him are all him, but they're different characters. So I think almost in the way he lives his life is theater.
Well, and we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that one of his last albums was a gospel album. Snoop has literally given expression to so many different forces that sometimes feel like they're in opposition with each other. He for a long time, coached his son's Pee Wee League football team and was still very outspoken about his marijuana use. He had changed his name to Snoop Lion for some times. He is an ever-evolving figure. And in many of the ways that Dionysus had his own narrative continue to evolve and change as people would adopt that narrative, Snoop has been more in control of his own narrative in that he's driven much of his own mythology. But I think we still see a very similar pattern in Snoop as we saw as people worshipped Dionysus and as Dionysus made his way as a god out of the cities and into the tribal villages and in areas around Greece. The narratives around Dionysus changed as the story moved out into the countryside. And I think Snoop has driven that, but his narrative continues to evolve and continues to change.
But he always kind of represents that sense of release. Yes. Even when he is doing these gospel albums, he and Dionysus always symbolize like, oh, I can be myself. I can be free.
Yeah.
And that's a great, archetype to represent.
Yes, yes. Well, it is time for us to give the audience a resource that's been significant for us this week. It's a skeleton key that we have to offer. And Torri, what do you have for us this week?
I have been doing a lot of listening to some West Coast rap. I'm not going to lie to you. I did. I went back.
Love it.
The Chronic is a perfect album. And wow. So that's kind of been, and which is weird. I don't want to say like going back to my childhood, but that was what my father let me listen to. Mm-hmm. So kind of going back to that and understanding the space, especially with the kind of East Coast, West Coast time, because I was a little younger to really grasp that at the time. But understanding too, and listening to the music of kind of what a singular figure Snoop Dogg is. Yeah. And that he is so unusual, and not unusual, but such an individual in that space. Yes. And represents something different. So
I'm glad you brought up The Chronic too, because really his appearances on The Chronic before his own album, Doggy Style, came out, that really began to solidify his character after the Deep Cover soundtrack much more than people had a good sense of who he was coming off The Chronic, because he wrote so much of that album with Dre.
Yeah, it's a perfect album. So we'll go with The Chronic this week.
Yes, I love it. We could go with the Chronic album just about any week as a good resource, mythological or otherwise. I have two resources I've been looking at this week. The first is a book by Walter F. Otto called Dionysus, Myth and Cult. And if you're interested in sort of getting the lowdown on the historical aspects of Dionysus and how the various cultic followers of this god performed their rituals and how they worshipped and what was going on historically, you won't find a better book. However, there is a book I like even better about Dionysus by Carl Carigny, and it's called Dionysus, Archetypal Image of Indestructible Life. And what I love about this book is it not only is about the historical aspects and mythological aspects of Dionysus, but it gets deep into the psychological aspects using Carl Jung's archetypes and his discussions around archetypal images in order to help us more fully understand why people had such an interest in Dionysus and why Dionysus was worshipped. So if you're interested in those sort of deep dives into Dionysus, you can't do better than Walter F. Otto and Carl Carigny. Torri, I am super excited about our guest today. We've got Dr. Devon Deimler, who is a mythologist. She's got a PhD in mythology and depth psychology, and she has some really interesting thoughts about Snoop as the modern Dionysus, and specifically in how Snoop has connected with Martha Stewart and the relationship between the two of them. So let's not delay anymore. Let's get right into this discussion with Dr. Devon Deimler. Hello, everybody. We are here with Dr. Devon Deimler, who is amazing. And she is a mythologist and scholar, but also someone who has a foot in the real world and keeps up with pop culture as Torri and I do. So welcome to Skeleton Keys, Dr. Deimler.
Thank you for having me.
Well, maybe you can begin by telling us a little bit about who you are and your work.
Sure. Well, I earned my PhD earlier this year in January from Pacifica Graduate Institute, which I believe you just did also, John. Congratulations. We'll have to talk about that after. And since then, and actually during that same time period of working on the PhD work, I work at Opus Archives and Research Center, located at Pacifica. So that is an archive with the collections of people like James Hillman, some of Joseph Campbell's collection, Marion Woodman, Chris Downing, and others. My background is in the arts and music. My undergraduate degree is in interdisciplinary sculpture. So I am trying to sort of, keep in touch with the real world and the material world while I get into this far out mythological stuff. But I think it's all grounded in the real world. Otherwise, I'm doing a lot of different work right now. I'm doing some work with the Philosophical Research Society that I'm excited about, various other things.
Amazing. A few months ago, I told you, Devon, that Torri and I had been working on an episode about Snoop Dogg as the modern projection of Dionysus. Mm-hmm. And over a couple of drinks, you began to wax philosophical about that idea and blew my mind with some of the stuff that you came up with. One of the things you came up with that was really, really interesting to me was with regards to Snoop's relationship with Martha Stewart, as that being somewhat mythological. So I just want to give you the floor to share those ideas because I thought it was really, really interesting. So what do you see there? What's the mythological relationship between Snoop and Martha?
Well, I can talk about Dionysus and Hestia, and we can see how you think that resonates with Snoop and Martha.
Yes.
But yeah, it's a curious, unlikely pairing, and I find that fascinating. My dissertation was on Dionysus as a sort of archetypal figure for aesthetic experience. So I got into kind of the heart of that work was the heart, the aesthetic leap of the heart that Hillman talks about are sort of those moments of really big affect and transformation and how that's experienced as our heart kind of leaping towards things. And part of what really committed me to writing about that and exploring that was a little vision I had of Dionysus and Hestia, and I don't often have these things. But so I really wanted to get into that relationship, and it was just sort of an intuition that I had. And once I started getting further into the research, I came across something that I had not heard before, which is that Dionysus was one of the latecomers to the Olympic pantheon. And the way that he got his seat, one of the 12 seats on Olympus, is that Hestia turned hers over to him. And she was sort of the one that had been established with most permanence there. So it's interesting. So that indicated that they do indeed have this actual relationship to one another. From there, it's a lot of extrapolation and kind of mythopoetic thinking, because there's, with Hestia in general, there's not a ton written about her. She remains this kind of veiled figure, and Dionysus is quite different. So I feel like I can throw a few things out there, and then maybe you want to jump in with more questions because there's a lot. But one of the things that I find very interesting about their relationship is that, to me, they create this kind of uncanniness. And I think you could say that about Hestia and Snoop too. And for Freud, the uncanny was the strangely familiar. So Dionysus is this kind of stranger, this disruptor, figure of strangeness in general. And she's the home. She's the center of the universe. She's the hearth. But they share this kind of common seat. So they have lots of differences, lots of similarities, but they kind of can come together around the fire, I guess. And that could be cooking. That could be whatever else they're up to with.
Whatever else they're burning.
I don't know. Those are a few thoughts off the bat. Let's see.
Well, I mean, you just spoke about the fire, and Hestia is associated with the flame and the hearth, Martha with her cooking, and then we have Dionysus with transformative substances and Snoop with his preferred transformative substance of weed. There's definitely that correlation there. I mean, that's straightforward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is. Hestia is this kind of virginal figure who's all about limitation and preserving. And you could see Martha Stewart, I think, for a long time was considered somebody who really represented this wholeness and this kind of perfect homemaking and welcoming with her cooking. But Dionysus also they share that interest of bringing people together in different ways. But yeah, I think, the fire really resonates for cooking. For Dionysus, the fire, he's kind of born in fire. He's a lightning strike. His followers carry torches. He's got all kinds of fire elements in his mythos. But what I think the heart of their relationship is really this affection for the everyday, the kind of the common world that he doesn't get a lot of credit for. And that's what I kind of focused more on, is he's a nature god, first of all. So he's about the world that's here And he's the most beloved god of the earth. And Hestia is the earth goddess too. So I know a lot more about them than Snoop and Martha in particular. But I think if you start riffing on those, I can add to it.
Well, Snoop is someone that in his music has been very explicit in his discussions of sexuality. Mm-hmm. And there are certain connections to sexuality with Dionysus. What are some of those connections?
Yeah, you cut out a tiny bit for me right there, John. But in terms of Dionysus is through and through a god of eroticism, interpenetration, orgasm. He's called the God who comes, which is, read that how you will. It'll work either way. He is, a god of bodies. And also the way, aesthetically speaking, he's the god of how our bodies get excited by experience. So, but yeah, he gave women a lot of sexual freedom in his rites. He himself is an androgynous god and a god who is bisexual or pansexual. So very much the god known for wine and then probably second most for free love.
Well, and on those lines, what do we know about the rituals associated with him? I think one of the things Torri and I have talked about is the various theatrical rituals that Snoop Dogg has participated in the 1993 VMA Awards. Mm-hmm. But what do we know about the rituals of Dionysus?
Well, we know some details, and probably some people know more than me, but we also importantly don't know a lot. The old mysteries are, as I'm sure you know, still quite mysterious. So he was a god of theater. So we know a good bit about those rituals because they came into the city and they're more documented. But in terms of other rituals, they were more private. There are some known rites for women. Women went off into the wilderness in the winter and kind of reveled freely. So their freedom wasn't, I don't think, premised on sex so much as liberty for their gender. Let's see. He's a part of the Eleusinian mysteries, for sure. He represents the new child in those mysteries. He was part of the Orphic mysteries in a slightly more confusing sense. He was considered their sort of underworld guide. So they had various rituals of devouring raw meat, ripping apart raw meat. And a lot of those were borrowed allegedly from older mysteries that focused on women. Orphics tend to focus more on men. Let's see.
Just to review, basically, you've said Dionysus is god of wine and vegetation. Mm-hmm. Snoop is a certain god of vegetation, we could say. Mm-hmm. We could say. Yep. You've mentioned that Dionysus is always surrounded by women. Mm-hmm. Check when it comes to Snoop.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the various activities at Dionysian festivals, orgies, ingesting strange herb. Check for Snoop. As far as I wonder if I'm not mistaken, just to continue with the female presence with Dionysus, the Miniads and Satyrs connected to Dionysus, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
That's definitely correct. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure of the correct pronunciations. I'm sure I'm always doing it wrong. But yeah, the Maenads.
I'm sure you're right and I'm wrong on that.
Well, no, like none of us know. But yeah, he's an interesting god. He kind of has his own group of gods, of sub-gods, including the satyrs and the Maenads. And the satyrs are often trying to pursue the Maenads, and the Maenads can't really be touched in that way. But they're his most ecstatic followers, the women, and they're intoxicated. And that's obviously an important element for Dionysus and Snoop and maybe Martha. Food's intoxicating too.
That's true.
As is fame. But yeah, the Maenads are his most notorious followers, and they're based on real women, or real women probably imitated the myths and folk tales at that point of these figures. But I think there were likely substances in these rituals that could alter minds. I think mind alteration is the basic way you could describe Dionysus. And there's literature out there about how real were these women, how much are they fiction, but it seems to be a good portion of both.
I mean, you could even say that in terms of the women that Snoop describes in his music.
Oh, yeah.
Is like, are these real women? Are these characters that he's created? Or So that similarity is absolutely there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an interesting similarity in that Snoop has many names. Calvin Brodus, Snoop Doggy Dogg, Snoop Dogg, Snoop Lion.
Snoop Lion I wanted to bring up for sure.
Yeah. So Snoop got that name when he saw a Rastafarian who said, you're the lion. And if anyone called me a lion, I'm taking that in my name too. Yeah. So I get it.
Yes.
But Dionysus has also been associated with a very big cat.
Yes, he is the big cat. And, in a lot of ways, he's most explicitly, he has more names and epithets than any other god. He's got more epiphanies than any other god. And he was very much, I think a lot of the gods were, but him most expressly, like he was the bull, he was the lion, he was the wine, he was like the concrete manifestations of himself. So yeah, but big cats are the biggest maybe next to the bull. And those are lions, tigers. There's old mosaics of him riding tigers, and he and the earth goddess, Rhea, but also Hestia. They're very the same in many ways. They both drive these chariots of big cats, these noisy chariots of these powerful, powerful felines. So yeah, and he's often wearing leopard skin on himself.
Ooh, I just thought of another one. It's jogging my mind here for connections. Snoop had this turn with putting out a gospel album, and in a sense, he recognized he was a son of God. And Dionysus, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was a son of Zeus.
Yeah.
Yeah,
he's the son of Zeus, so he's half mortal, which I think is an important reason why people related to him so familiarly. He died, quote unquote, again and again, like we do. And yeah, so he was son of Zeus, and actually not just procreated by Zeus, but born out of him also. So he's twice born. His mortal mother dies in Zeus's flame, and so Zeus sews him up in his own thigh, and he's born again. In other stories, he's still the son of Zeus in the Orphic stories, but his mother is Persephone, the queen of the underworld in that case. So either way, he's got, very compelling, very fiery, enigmatic origins.
Nice.
Yeah.
Do you think that we need, as a culture, the Dionysus archetype?
I think that we do. I think we're going to get it, whether we want it or not. I think that's kind of how it goes. But no, I think we need it. I think we crave it, especially at different phases of life. But I think there's lots of ways to say that we need it. An appreciation of nature, of sexuality, of human freedoms, of ecstasy, just these more liberated experiences, these less repressive experiences, because he'll sort of force it either way. And he's a great entertainer. So I think that's an essential need as well. Yeah, which Snoop is there for.
Continuing sort of to pull the thread even further about the psychological aspects of this mythological archetype, I wonder if you would be comfortable riffing for a second just on this idea of the Dionysian in our culture that is changing so rapidly. How do we have Dionysus in the Me Too culture? How do we have Dionysus in a culture that is serious about intersectionality? And I love that you had mentioned Dionysus as an androgynous, but how do we best understand or unpack Dionysus in an age that has so many nuances to how we understand these things now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think maybe we could say, if we were going to talk in this way, I think we could say that we're missing him a bit. We're missing certain points he has to make. I think we're seizing on others. An interesting thing to keep in mind if we were to forward him as a bit of a guide right now is that he's one of the few gods that it doesn't violate women until you get to his Roman counterpart, Bacchus. So I think that another important value of his to bring in is that his real purpose is to disrupt rigid structures, edifications that are not serving people's freedoms. So he's a good model for that. I think he's a good model for valuing all types of sexuality, of not having to choose between one or two. Let's see. I think on an entertainment sort of communal festive level, I feel a little lack for real Dionysian experiences. And maybe that's because I'm older and I spend time writing dissertations. But I think it's interesting to know, and I don't know if Snoop has done this yet or not, but, people are now trying to kind of resurrect the dead, like James Dean or Tupac, in these festivals that have the money to do, to try to materialize the departed. So I think maybe that, I don't know, I haven't experienced one of these hologram performances, but it might indicate this kind of longing for the body, for a bodily catharsis. I think he's an important god to keep in mind in terms of our ecological crisis. I think any violation of the earth is a violation of him in some sense. And he can be very wrathful. So I think we're starting to see some of those returns too. So those are a few thoughts.
It's so good. So
Cool.
good. So fascinating. Such an interesting connection, I think, between the way that these classic ancient archetypes that were so significant in Greek culture are in so many ways still very, very relevant to today. And we see them being manifest and rising up in culture. And it's not planned. It just rises out of the unconscious. We can observe it, but I don't think we can create it.
Yeah, well, not necessarily. I mean, you can try and maybe you can succeed, but that's another element of his that is related to your point, is that he's going to arrive whether called or not. And I think that we're speaking in terms of like a kind of personage here, but I think these things are all personifications of different powers that are all in relationship. So if one dynamic of our cultural psychology gets a little too much power, others will enter. It's just all kind of very natural. So I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you taking time to be on the podcast with us today and share these insights. I've literally been excited for months to have you come on and talk about these things.
Oh, good. I feel like I skipped stones over the surface, but
it's so good. People will be chewing on these ideas for a long time. I guarantee it.
Cool.
Can you tell people if people are interested in following more of your work and keeping up with you, where can people find you?
So I live a little bit on the internet. I have a website. It's just my name, devondeimler.com. My dissertation is on there, a couple other pieces of writing, some art. I'm also doing this myth and film series at the Philosophical Research Society, if anyone's in LA. So info about that is on my site, but also prs.org. That's it.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Devon Deimler, thank you for taking time to be with us and use your powers of insight to help us craft a skeleton key for Snoop Dogg.
Yeah. I hope it added something. And I think that ability for Snoop and Martha to be friends, that's hope. So, yeah.
So good. Yeah. So good. Devon, thank you. That was amazing.
Was it? Okay.
Yes.
No, it really was. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I'm just pulling thoughts where I can. So
it's really interesting stuff. It really is.
I don't doubt that. Yeah, I'm still fascinated by it for sure.
Wow. Dr. Devon Deimler dropping knowledge bombs all over the place. What struck you about what she pulled out there, Torri?
I guess I never really thought about the ecological connection to Dionysus. Of course, I knew he was the god of the vine and associated him with nature, but I just never thought of it in a modern way. Yeah. And now I can't disassociate himself from it.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm going to be watching whatever Snoop does in pop culture in his career in the future with extra wide open eyes. Yeah, just trying to see if I can see other areas where this Dionysian archetype is expressing itself through what he does.
Well, it's interesting when we were brainstorming topics for the season, when this one came up, this was the one I was like, yep, absolutely. Yeah. Like it immediately connected.
Yeah.
And so I'm with you and that I'm curious to see, I feel throughout his career, Dionysus has been there. So it'll be interesting to see how Dionysus evolves.
I can't wait. I cannot wait. And that whole thing about Snoop and Martha being connected to the fire. Wow. And, Martha being sort of that Hestian figure that's the god of the hearth and the goddess of the home. That's just, wow. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. If you have thoughts you want to share with us about this episode, find us on the interwebs. We are in a number of places, but you can email us at skeletonkeypod@gmail.com. We're also available on the socials. Where can they find us on the socials, Torri?
And you can also follow us on social media at Skeleton Keys Pod. That is on Twitter and Instagram. You can also follow us individually. I am on Twitter and Instagram at Torri Yates Orr. That's TorriYatesOrr.
I'm on Twitter at John K. Booker, Bucher. I'm on Instagram at Telling a Better Story. Torri, I cannot wait to get into something else next week. Thanks for being my partner in exploration in crafting these skeleton keys to unlock the secrets of history, mythology, and pop culture.
We're unlocking everything, people. The keys are here.
Talk to you guys again soon.